Today on the show, we welcome the well-recognized South African artist, activist, and educator Adam Broomberg as we discuss the newly formed Israeli government, deteriorating situation on the ground, and Palestinian activism globally. Marhaba, Adam, and welcome back to Free Palestine Pod. Let's talk Palestine.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
With all masks finally off, Adam, could the makeup of this new Jewish supremacy-led fascist Israeli government finally free Palestine?
Um, I I don't think all the masks are off, and I don't think that it's up to the Israeli government to free Palestine personally. I think if we are relying on them to free Palestine, we'll wait centuries. I think it is an interesting moment, and I think we should discuss a couple of the key characters who are part of this coalition, because if they were in such positions of power in any other country, I mean, the national security minister or the finance minister, if you had somebody as homophobic, as racist, as genocidal, and outspokenly so in any other country, I think there would just be international outrage. Whereas here it just seems to be like, say what you want to say, with absolute impunity. So I think it is an interesting time, and we saw thousands of Israelis take to the streets to protest, but it's one thing to go on a walk in the streets of Tel Aviv with a sign. It's another thing to use the privilege of your Jewish body, which inherently is privileged because of the laws of the country and the Jewish supremacy, to actually to protect Palestinian allies. And I think that's a very different level of sacrifice. And I'm not sure that, and there are Israeli activists who do it, but they're very few, because people are very comfortable in their positions of Jewish supremacy.
But with the makeup of the new government, like what I'm implying to about the masks are off is that to a global audience, there is no more justification to being allied with where the Israeli government is headed. There's, like, as I said, all masks are off. So it's time where people need to finally show their solidarity against apartheid, against the occupation, which is being much more entrenched.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you. If we were living in a humane, ethical world, so let's just discuss kind of two of the key characters, right? You've got the new National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, right? So he's the leader of the Jewish Power faction. Ironically, he was refused to serve in the Israeli army because he was so radical in his politics. And as you know, he was influenced by Meir Kahane and an organization that he formed, the Kach organization, which was deemed by the FBI a terrorist organization. And not only that, I mean, so Ben-Gvir joined that organization at the age of 16, and Ben-Gvir, until very recently, had a portrait of Baruch Goldstein up in his living room. And Goldstein is famous for, in 1994, walking into the Cave of Patriarchs and mass murdering Palestinian people in the midst of their prayer. 29 people were killed, over 100 were injured. And 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 the national security minister of the government of Israel had a picture of this mass murderer up on his wall as if he was a hero, right? And also the things he said. I mean, he literally, I've just got a couple of quotes here. He said, "When we form the government, I will promote the deportation law, which will deport anyone who acts against the state of Israel or IDF soldiers." He goes on to say, "The time has come for a full-fledged right-wing government. It's time to be the landlords in our country," right? And just yesterday, he banned the display of the Palestinian flag in public. And what was very interesting is if you listen to the words he used, he said, "Today I directed the Israeli police to enforce the prohibition of flying any PLO flag that shows identification with a terrorist organization from the public sphere, and to stop any incitement against the state of Israel." So in this sentence, he's essentially calling the entire Palestinian people a terrorist organization, right? And
yes,
I mean, it's a mathematical equation. That's what he's doing. And then if we just look at the finance minister, Smotrich, Bezalel, who's, said, "I'm proudly, openly homophobic." There's this quote he said, "It's only natural my wife would not want to lie next to someone who just gave birth to a baby that might murder her baby in 20 years," when he was advocating for Palestinians and Israelis to be separated in obstetrics units. I mean, these are things that are unsayable. You can't even say these things to yourself if you're that toxic. And they are so empowered and so emboldened, and they're saying them out loud. And yet, 2 days ago, AIPAC had a meeting with 100 donors and gave Netanyahu a standing ovation.
Imagine.
And so
of course.
For some reason, like, Israel seems to be an ethical, like, Bermuda Triangle. It's like it's the place where ethics just disappear, right? Because you're absolutely right. I mean, if in any other country, two people who are so toxic and speak their toxicity with such confidence and bravado, that country and that government would be sanctioned and would be punished, and it seems like, yes, it's part of the mask is off, for sure, but I think they just, what they're doing is speaking a little bit more honestly about the policy that has been going on since 48, and certainly since 1967, right? They're just being more honest. Let's put it that way.
I mean, Adam, the way that I see it, I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu is the one orchestrating this entire situation right now in Israel, especially these two ministers that you're discussing, Ben-Gvir being one of them. He is by far, at least in my humble opinion, probably the most powerful head of state to date. And he is relentless. He's methodical. He is smart. He is so smart. And he is behind this. That Ben-Gvir is not even smart enough, I'm sorry, with all due respect, to make these statements and he came from nowhere. He was handpicked. And it's really Netanyahu who's behind this entire government. So the real question is there any way to neutralize Benjamin Netanyahu, or is there any way to actually get rid of him? I mean, because he's really the culprit.
You know, there's always a Netanyahu. There's always a Hitler. There's always a Verwoerd. There's always going to be somebody to take a place that the world allows, or that place to exist. So I wouldn't grant him too much. I think you're giving him too much credit. I think he's a revolting, lying, despicable human being. You know, who is just taking use of this kind of well, anyway, to scratch that. But my point being is that there is always a Netanyahu. I don't think it's his particular genius. I think he's a hideous, lying, revolting person. But if it wasn't him, somebody else would step into that place, because without the world imposing international law on Israel, there will always be somebody to step into that place. And I think what's happened is that as the violence and as the kind of punitive action against Palestinians has increased, and the Israelis have seen that they can act with impunity, a move to the right, to the extreme, is just a natural move. And I think hopefully this is going to galvanize the international community. I don't think we should rely on the Israeli government or the Israeli citizens, because they've been occupying that place since 48 and really enjoying their privilege.
Adam, how can we then expand and drive BDS globally, considering the reality on the ground? And because at the end of the day, that's what brought South Africa to its knees, when it was sanctioned and essentially made a pariah state globally. How can we leverage that, in your opinion, as a South African?
Yeah, I think I'm hesitant to kind of use the acronym BDS, because first of all, it's illegal in this country, believe it or not, to say those three letters in that order. I mean, I've literally got the German government telling me, after having killed the majority of my family, they telling me what anti-Semitism looks like. I mean, the irony just couldn't be crazier. So, but I think I get your point, and I think essentially the South African government was broke, and it wasn't a sudden moral awakening. It lost any of the world's support, and just like Israel, South Africa had Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan firmly behind the apartheid states of South Africa. And just like South Africa, that change is going to happen to Israel, because it's going to become just too much of a liability. And I think, but I also think we should just examine, because while we're talking now and while people are feeling good marching in the streets of Tel Aviv, laws are being changed, and these laws are radical, and these laws are going to have real life effects on real life people that we know. And I was just reading the appendices to the coalition agreement, so between the Likud and Religious Zionism party, and there's I'm sorry if this is boring, but there's like 4 key points that I think are really worth absorbing. And I've kind of divided them into 3 things, which is, one is the kind of declared change in the law. The first being a transfer of power from military occupation to Israeli civil government. And the method they're using is to ramp up the process of solidifying Israeli civil control of the West Bank. And what's the impact is it's going to create a situation in which legal advisors' primary loyalty is going to be towards the civilians in the occupied territory and not the Palestinians, and once again be allowed even more by law to ignore international law. And there's others, and I think we can go through them in detail, but essentially they reveal a very clear ideology behind this coalition, which is to get rid of the red tape and to expedite the annexation of the West Bank, and to, in their hope, expel the indigenous population, if not exterminate it. And I think that if you read these appendices, which will soon be enshrined in governmental law, that ideology is very, very clear.
Yes. I mean, Adam, the one main difference that I think always needs to be pointed out with South Africa and Israel is that South Africa was a classic colonization project. Israel is different because we're actually bringing in a religious, one of the monotheist groups, and creating the promise was to create a safe haven for them. And that's where I fundamentally see the biggest difference and the difficulties when people are constantly making this assimilation. Yes, there is an assimilation, and I read the 300-page report from Amnesty International, and it's dead on. But there is that difference that nobody really seems to be speaking about. And do you really think that the Israelis and even the Jews around the world, in the United States and in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, et cetera, are going to give up that safe haven in order to go back to pre-1948 sharing is caring, coexistence, all 3 pillar religions in one space? Do you think that this is actually plausible?
I mean, that safe haven or the bunker. I grew up, as you know, I'm 3rd generation Holocaust survivor. My grandmother, my bedtime stories were about the pogroms and the Cossacks, and my mother, lost 90% of her family. So for that generation, Israel definitely was this perfect safe haven. It was like, after centuries of persecution, and let's not deny it. I mean, the anti-Semitism runs deep and powerful and strong, and for centuries people, suffered and were killed and were oppressed, and finally, yes, they were offered this, like you say, safe haven, the perfect bunker. Unfortunately, they failed to reveal the real cost of providing or securing that safe haven. So the entire Jewish community was essentially lied to, because a land without people for a people without land. That was our motto, right? And I think what's happening now is that history is being revised, and it's being revised not only amongst academics or left-wing activists, but in popular culture. I mean, we've got films on Netflix that are like, charting at #1 right across Europe, that are revealing the violence that necessitated creating that safe haven. And this is new information for people. You've got to understand, So I think that's the first thing, that when that penny drops and people, when it starts dawning on people, which it is, that the safe haven was created at such a grave and terrible human cost. I think anyone with a kind of moral compass would start questioning the validity of that safe haven. And then I think the other thing is that, what we're seeing now is such an increase in international anti-Semitic attacks. And there's no doubt that there's a causal link between what's going on in Israel, the government, and the persecution of Palestinian people, and the anti-Semitic attacks. And I think Israel, far from being a safe haven, is actually turning into one of the most dangerous things for Jewry worldwide. And I think, and that will become increasingly clear. And I just hope it doesn't take too long, because what could happen is something worse than we saw in the Second World War, to be honest. And I really mean that.
Well, that takes me, Adam, to, clearly we have fascists in power now in the new Israeli government that openly also have discussed a third Nakba, and Jordan as the alternate homeland for the remaining of the Palestinians that are in the occupied territories and 48. Is this where you see the Israeli society headed? Especially that Israel continues to have unprecedented immunity against its crimes against the Palestinians since 48.
How do I put this? We've all got a dark side, right? And if we had to indulge that dark side, but and imagine a world for me without people who are homophobic or racist or misogynist, or I'd love to get rid of them. Honestly, if I could cast a wand and a spell, I'd get rid of them in a minute. And if we invert that, and I think if you had to ask the average Israeli if they could rub the genie and ask for a wish, and they'd love to get rid of the Palestinian people. So I don't think it's far-fetched, but look, if you look at the world map of the countries that support and acknowledge the existence of Palestine and the Palestinian people, as opposed to those who don't, it's all about whiteness, because they're all white, and it's all about colonialism, right? So it's all about the European colonial countries and America that was formed by decimating its indigenous population. So I think that's why Israel stands as a kind of important emblem, because in a way it kind of excuses their past, right? And Lana, you're right. There is a difference between South Africa and Israel. South Africa was a colony when colonialism was an international, was happening all around the world. Israel was formed when a process of decolonization was happening around the world, which makes it an absolute anomaly. And I think that that's also its Achilles heel. We can't be sitting in our museums and our universities all around the world talking about decolonization and intersectional solidarity and Black Lives Matter and queer thought and indigenous thought and not talk about Palestine. It doesn't make sense, right? I don't know. I still remain hopeful, I've got to say. And I think, but I'm scared. I'm scared for people I know, who are in increasing danger. And it's scary. It's really scary because they've let the dogs out, and it's like maybe the saying like it's got to get worse before it gets better, but I don't know. I mean, like something that just happened, and like I don't want to be over like sentimental, but as we discussed before this, I lost my mother 2 weeks ago, and I just suddenly a week later, somebody sent me portraits of all the 60 children that were Palestinian children that were killed by Israeli military or the settlers last year. And I was kind of looking at these pictures mechanically and lining up the eyes and, to make an edit of these things. And I stopped and I just suddenly thought, oh my God, I looked at one, but I was like, each one of these people has a family, has parents and siblings who are feeling the grief that I'm feeling now, but 1,000-fold worse, because my mother's death was part of the course of the universe. She was 86. She died with her dignity and in relative comfort, surrounded by her children. These deaths were violent and executed with blunt obedience of horrific bureaucratic I don't know, orders. I mean, talk about the banality of evil,
I mean, I feel that if we step back a little bit and we starting with around 1991 with Iraq, when I also saw that video, and I also, because of the Palestine lobby, we're constantly in touch with who was, killed, murdered every day. But when I saw those children, I realized that this is something that has been consistent since the 90s, since we started with Iraq. The United States, Europe, I don't know, they're wiping out so many children in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, in Palestine, and it's in Yemen. If you pay attention to the numbers, they're quite young, so somebody is definitely trying to get rid of an entire new generation of whoever we are, people from the Middle, I don't know, whatever. We're definitely not the white people. So that is going on. And Palestine is just really part and parcel. And actually, it's also, we've become so banal to the whole idea of children, whatever, they're all Palestinians. So, let them be killed. We need to protect our precious, nation state. But it's hard to understand, but it's actually a bit of a pattern that's been going on. Even in Iran, it's really children that are being killed, a totally different environment and different place, and nothing to do with this subject matter. But if you pay attention, there's a lot of brown, non-white children being killed since the 90s. It seems to be kind of systematic. Back to what you were saying about the progressives, except for Palestine. I'm sorry, I was just going to full circle back to the progressives except for Palestine. They do exactly that. They condemn situations that are happening in other parts of the world, but then when it comes to Palestine, they keep their mouth shut, applying exactly the same criteria and the same rules, the same standards, the same norms. However, when it comes to Palestinians, We have complete blinders on in the West. I don't know how we can combat that and how we can protect people like Isa Amro and people like yourself, and all the activists that are working so hard around the world right now, that are trying to get this message across that, hey, you can't just be progressive on every single subject matter but for Palestine. We've got to figure out a way to sit down with these heads of states, you guys, and talk to everyone about this. It seems so reasonable.
I mean, I think obviously the hypocrisy is makes me want to vomit into my own mouth. When I see Israelis showing solidarity to the women and children in Iran, but I think there is a difference. Is that, and this is, I think that. I think it's about propaganda and Hezbollah and the complete kind of blanketed control that things like the Jewish Defense League in the old days, the more subtle organizations, and the money behind it, like from Ronald Lauder and other massive benefactors who control the narrative. And I think, when we talk about these 60 deaths, I think between the three of us, we've got a lot of their faces and names embedded in our retina and in our hearts. Most of the world doesn't know about these deaths. They do not know about them. And I think that the only way to do this is to take control of the narrative, and I think that's also starting to happen because, I mean, look at this generation of Palestinians. They're thriving in every aspect of the world, where it's commerce or academia or film or fashion, and I think and still remaining kind of true to themselves, their identity, and not compromising on that. And I think that that blanket control over the narrative is starting to crack. And I think that's our biggest hope, really.
Agree. Ad, what's your views on Ben Gvir's provocative visit to Al-Aqsa compound recently, and this growing radical movement that is bent on the destruction of one of Islam's holiest sites?
I mean, I think it's if you look at his history from the age of 16, it's been a series of provocations. I'm not sure he's worth discussing. I think, if there was a strategy behind it, it might be to actually incite another intifada that could justify a kind of rapid extermination of a lot more people a lot quicker, which happened the last time somebody uninvited visited that holy site.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's that smart. I think he feels, he's the new sheriff in town. He's got the badge, he's got the gun, and he doesn't like people getting on with life, and I think also you can imagine how kind of intoxicated with the power they've just got. Can you imagine that? Like that level of toxicity mixed with power that's a deadly minestrone. That's awful, And so my fear is, not long term, because this is like the occupation just it's not going to go, it'll end. But my fear is the short term, and while these like rabid dogs are in power, I'm just scared of them hurting, people I love or anyone for that matter, And then I just think also, responding to like members of my family who live in Israel or friends, or responding to some of the activists who were kind of so excited about the march in Tel Aviv, and just say, I was like, now's the time to really to amp up, this protest, and literally to use, like I said, use your body, because your body is privileged. And just like what happened during Black Lives Matter, where white people would use their bodies as barriers, and there should be a 24-hour constant chain of people around every building and every family in Masafayata, non-stop, and then I will believe that the Israelis want to live a different life.
Adam, what it sounds like you're advising us and everyone out there is to somehow work with the actual people living in Israel, the actual Israeli citizens, non-Palestinian Israeli citizens, and try to get them on board. It sounds like we have some work to do there. What I experience in Europe in general is this constant idea because remember, Balfour was 1917, and then the creation of the State of Israel was 1948. So while there was a lot of, colonialism going on during that era, but then they still allowed Israel, as you said. But all of these heads of state and people from these governments in Central Europe have this feeling they at least tried to relay, that they don't believe that the Jewish people were actually capable of creating a nation state and exercising Jewish supremacy, considering the thousands of years of persecution that they underwent. So the question is, how do we combat this? Because here you have actually helped me grow and helped me to understand and to be comfortable even using the term Jewish supremacy, although I always knew that that's what was going on since the nation state law. That was even more clear, sorry. But now this next step, how can we convince people? Because I'm getting so much backlash. People are saying that, in fact, it's inconceivable that Jewish people who went through thousands of years of persecution could today, in fact, be persecuting another people. And it's help. How can we explain this to the West?
I mean, just to answer your first question is, I think there's not one strategy. There needs to be many, as you know. And I think finally we've got the ear of some of the people living in Israel, whereas up until now it felt like most of the left departed like a decade ago, as you know. But it seems like this younger generation who have also forgotten the Holocaust, much like the young generation in South Africa have forgotten the struggle against apartheid and what sacrifices their parents and grandparents had to make. And I think now they're living in a global society, in a global world, and they're looking at the ethical nature of the country they're living in and finding it unacceptable, at least a few of the people I'm speaking to. And I think it's starting to dawn on them that this is unacceptable, and all the old tricks of like pink washing, don't work anymore, and these people are being so outspoken, and the racism is, I mean, it's like the Proud Boys running a country, you know? Yeah, honestly, it's like
Ku Klux
one of
Klan.
those macho, yeah, it's like one of those macho, revolting, like, men who run podcasts, like running a country. But so I think like we do have access, and I think that, you know, a lot of my Palestinian friends would say, okay, Adam, that's your thing, you know. We don't care about what Israelis think about us. We don't care about the state, like the form of the Israeli government. This is only slightly worse than it was ever. But I think that there are kind of, I think that there is a realization, like, amongst the younger generation, and that should be used. But ultimately, it really comes down to, just like South Africa and just like any other country, without the whole international community imposing, you know, international law, it's not going to change. Like last week, Biden gave, what was the check? 3 billion, 4 billion? And this is in full knowledge of him, you know, feeding a fascist, racist, homophobic, misogynist government. You know, that's who he gave $3 billion to.
Right. He drinks the Kool-Aid like all the other heads of European heads of state. I mean,
yeah.
yeah.
But look at us. Look at these conversations that are happening, and you know, and I don't know. I think that, I just think it's so important to just like keep the faith and know that this is it's going to be a hard battle. It has to be fought on numerous fronts, not just one. And I think, and to be honest, I'm the last person to ask, you know, because every time I'm in Palestine and I open my mouth, I'm very quickly silenced and am taught, you know, all the kind of cul-de-sacs that I think are kind of brilliant strategies, where they lead to, you know. So I think we also got to acknowledge that there are some immensely committed, very smart, and organized activists inside Palestine and in the diaspora that are working on a very big scale.
Yes. Well, I mean, it would be great to work on a big scale, but I mean, the biggest problem that we have is that we can't even entertain elections as long as Benjamin Netanyahu is in power, and he's been the longest standing prime minister. I mean, it's quite impressive, this guy, and I am really impressed with him. But I know that we need some sort of a concurrence, and we need the other superpowers to kind of see through him. But for now, he never ceases to impress me. Just when Obama was president and he went before Congress without having the permission and from the actual head of state, and being told not to do so, he went before Congress and spoke. No other head of state has ever done that. And this unequivocal support from the United States, these billion, you know, coming close to $10 billion annually, that they're receiving through different mediums, but from the government, but also from many, many organizations within the United States and AIPAC and its omnipresence in the US. I mean, when you live, I'm, you know, from the States, and when you live in the capital, people refer to AIPAC as the lobby. They don't even call it, you know, the American Israeli lobby. It's the lobby on the Hill. And they're present in every form of lobbying, not just political lobbying, corporate lobbying. I mean, you know, they are everywhere and omnipresent. I have a hard time understanding today. Everyone asks me, and I feel like you have so much insight given your background and given the fact that you're not a Palestinian activist, you're actually a South African Jewish activist. I think that's how you would describe yourself. But you know, how can we break these barriers? How can we help all these activists? I know that there are teams that are trying to put together, you know, a new government for the Palestinians, but it's never going to happen with the current regime. They're not going to allow it to happen. So what is it going to take for us to like get over? Everyone's talking about us, the World Cup. There was so much love for the Palestinians. People know that we need to be freed. We need to be able to walk around freely in our own country that we've lived in for centuries. The message is out there, but like, what is, for me, we're asking you, but what is the pivotal point for us to get the Jewish European and the Jewish American, who I think are extremely influential, the Zionists, but also the Jewish Americans and the Jewish Europeans, extremely influential in dealing with Palestine and Israel. Where can we get them to shoot to the other side of the pendulum? What can we do?
First of all, just to address your respect for Netanyahu, I think, you know, growing up in a community of 250,000, a very tight community of 250,000 Jews in South Africa, that kind of what they would call chutzpah, that kind of you know, arrogant strut and entitled way of behaving, I don't find impressive, especially from you know, a white elderly man. That just smacks of somebody who lacks empathy, solidarity, and love, to be honest. So I think that those actions are, yeah, they may be the actions of a successful politician, but that's not what I deem anything of value. But and then just to move on to kind of, you know, I think Israel, obviously in 48 and after the Holocaust, was the kind of, you know, it stood as the emblem of, like you said, the haven for persecuted, you know, ethnic, religious people. And I think what we saw during the World Cup and with those flags is that Palestine is starting to take on that almost mythological kind of iconic status as the people who are most oppressed. And I think that, you know, if the more that solidarity is shown, and the more that intersectional solidarity, the more that Black Lives Matter speak about Palestine, engage with Palestine as they have, the more that LGBTQI plus communities do, the way that indigenous communities who are becoming more and more vocal and more powerful. And I think Palestine's becoming the kind of poster girl, the poster, you know, for those international struggles of the dispossessed. And I think that's incredibly hopeful, because that's what Israel was 75 years ago, right?
Right.
And you know, with Orientalism at full force, I mean, it was the Jews who were the victims, right? And suddenly here was this heroic small state that was thing, and I think I think it's done a 180-degree shift, which we saw, and I mean, and wasn't that beautiful? I mean, really beautiful. And I think it's not only at the World Cup; you see it everywhere. You know, you see like low riders in Los Angeles, like, you know, these cars bouncing up and down with Free Palestine on them. It's like it's becoming, you know, it's becoming the right thing to do, and it's becoming sexy, and it's becoming you know, as it's becoming just, what do I say? Yeah, sorry, I lost it there. You're gonna have to edit that.
À la mode. It's becoming à la mode.
Yeah,
Well,
which is
I'll
also
tell
important.
you, yeah. Yes, it is. It absolutely is. I mean, it definitely has to be a trend, and definitely a trend, you know, to explain the proper narrative and to combat 106 years of Zionist propaganda. And I mean, there's a lot of work to be done on the ground. I think what we're all concerned with is just making sure that the right people speak to the right entities, and that we somehow figure out how to change the course of what's happening today in Israel, which is just so extremely unsettling. You can imagine for a Palestinian, but I would imagine even as a liberal person who's a liberal Jew, I would imagine that it would also be very disturbing to see what's happening today. So it's unsettling,
Yeah,
and
it is. But
yeah. I mean, but I know what you mean. We can't give up. We have to keep going. But I feel like there's a lot more that we all need to do, and we all kind of need to get together more. I feel like we need to work a little bit more with other Jewish activists and Israeli activists. I don't know, maybe we can organize a get together, but I feel like we all kind of need to make sure that we're on the same page, and that we're all pushing for the same goal. We all have the same goal. So
totally. But I mean, if you had to see who's been reaching out to me, I posted something flippant about, does anybody want to join me on my next trip to Palestine on my Instagram thing. I literally got, I think I've got about 300 emails. And not only that, I also got, you know, people like Cat Power, and who wants to bring Nick Cave, who, you know, tragically played in Israel a couple of times, but now wants to play in Palestine. And people like, you know, Miranda July, and people who, and these are people who have access to the younger generation. And whenever I kind of start losing a bit of faith, I have a conversation with my teenage daughter, who's like, you know, she's done with the patriarchy, you know, and Israel is part of that. And all these revolting white men, like, you know, strutting through the Senate of America, or you know, making abortion illegal in Poland. I think we've got to see Israel also in the constellation of a kind of weather system that's happening in the world, and we, you know, the fascism in Israel is not just isolated to it. It's very much part of a European fascist rise, and I think, just like always, there's going to be a massive change and reprisal and shift against that. And I think with that shift against that, you know, with Bolsonaro out, and when Erdogan's gone, and when Hungary's free in Poland, and you know, that generation, I think the next generation is going to bring in change, and a free Palestine is part of that agenda, absolutely part of it, My 13-year-old daughter speaks about it, and it's not because of my influence, you know. So that gives me such like faith and such hope. I don't think our generation is you know, we can build a little infrastructure, but we're not the right ones to lead this thing. Believe me, it's going to happen. But and they're going to demand change when they've got access to a little bit of power, that generation. And they're in touch with each other, you know, like never before.
Yep.
So,
Well,
so it's
go ahead. Sorry.
No.
I was going to say on that note, I just want to tell you that we have a few members of the lobby that are madly in love with you, and a few other people around that are constantly asking me about you. So you're very popular with all of the Palestinian activists. So they see huge, they see some sort of l'esprit. I mean, they feel like you make them feel like there's actually hope. And so you're doing a lot of good, so much good out there. And I think our generation still has a lot more